After the bloody but major victory for the Confederacy at the Second Bull Run, Robert E. Lee went forward with his first invasion of the North. It was not an easy advance. The rebels faced resistance at Harper's Ferry and South Mountain. Lee's men had basically fought for over 3 weeks straight. His regiments were thinning because of the constant fighting, and these casualties would be felt on the next battlefield. The two armies met along Antietam Creek outside the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. On the night of September 16, 1862, a small engagement northeast of town between John Bell Hood's rebels and Brigadier General Truman Seymour's brigade of Pennsylvania Reserves set the battle lines for the next day's fight. Around 5:15 a.m. on September 17th, the Confederate advance line on the left flank was held by Douglas's brigade of Georgians in the field south of Miller's cornfield, James Walker's brigade to their right, and the Stonewall Brigade and Penn's brigade formed to their left. Seymour's men had stayed on the field the whole night, waiting to re-engage with the enemy at dawn. The Pennsylvanians pushed back the 31st Georgia, but the 13th and 5th Pennsylvania Reserves could not hold out against two enemy brigades. The 13th, running low on ammunition and not having eaten since noon the previous day, pulled back, and the 1st and 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves took their place. And to the right, one of Abner Doubleday's brigades, full of New Yorkers, moved through Miller's cornfield to engage with the Georgians. Right behind the New Yorkers was the Iron Brigade, and they moved to the New Yorkers' right. At first, Duray's men took position along the fence line, but the 105th and 104th New York moved into the field to attack the Georgians. Both sides threw volley after volley into each other until Walker moved the 21st Georgia and the 21st North Carolina to the Union flank, catching the New Yorkers off guard and sending them back to the fence line. Brigadier General John Gibbon's right flank was threatened by the Stonewall Brigade and Penn's brigade, so he sent the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin to the west in an attempt to outflank the Confederates. Douglas asked for reinforcements. His division commander Alexander Lawton ordered Hayes' small Louisiana brigade to Douglas's right. As the Confederates were reinforcing their line, Duray saw what he believed to be rebel troops on his flank in the woods to the east of the cornfield. What he saw was most likely some of Seymour's brigade falling back. Nevertheless, Duray pulled his entire brigade back to avoid being flanked. The Confederates, seeing the blue troops evacuate their position, ordered an advance, but before they could reach the cornfield, Hartsuff's brigade took the place of the New Yorkers and delivered devastating volleys into the Louisianians and Georgians, which forced them back. The 6th and 2nd Wisconsin of the Iron Brigade advanced on the Georgians. Gibbon sent 3 companies from the 6th west of the Hagerstown Pike to occupy the Stonewall Brigade and Penn's brigade on their right flank. Early in the fighting, Brigadier General John R. Jones, the commander of the Stonewall Division, had an enemy shell explode over his head and disorient him. While he recovered, Brigadier General William E. Stark took command of the division. Stark could see Douglas's Georgians beginning to fall back due to the pressure placed on them by Hartsuff and Gibbon. He wanted to keep the Confederate extreme left secure and encouraged the Stonewall Brigade and Penn's men to hold their position. But the two brigades barely had 500 men combined. Penn himself was merely a captain leading a brigade. Grigsby, leading the Stonewall Brigade, was a colonel. Artillery fire and musketry was thinning their ranks. The rebels had no choice. They had to fall back to safety. Stark, in an effort to save the Confederate line, sent his last 2 brigades, his own brigade of Louisianians under Jesse Williams and Tolliver's brigade, now under James Jackson, to the Hagerstown Pike. The 6th and 2nd Wisconsin, along with the 84th New York and the 2nd United States Sharpshooters, wheeled to meet the Confederate threat. Additionally, the rest of the Iron Brigade, backed up by parts of Patrick's brigade, attacked them from behind, which sent the rest of Stark's men into a retreat. Among the fallen was Stark himself, placing Colonel Grigsby of the Stonewall Brigade in command of the entire division. The situation was dire for the rebels. Word got to General Hood that his troops were needed. His veterans began filing in around the Dunker Church around 7 a.m. A member of the 1st Texas remembered, standing inactive, conscious of unseen danger with bullets whistling over and around them, the increasing rattle of musketry in front, and now and then the ominous shriek of a shell as it tears through the ranks. The strain upon the men is terrible. Hood's regiments became squished in the confines of the fenced-in Cloverfield, but they nevertheless pushed forward and drove the Yankees back. Hood himself micromanaged the situation, sending the 4th Texas as support for the regiments attacking the cornfield, and the 5th Texas to extend the line on the right. Collectively, Hood's division rolled up most of the brigades in their front. Numerous blue troops commented on the ferociousness of the attack and the intimidating sound of the rebel yell. Law's men, when they got to the north end of the cornfield, found 2 brigades under Brigadier General George Meade. To the west, Part of Gibbon's and Patrick's brigades were still in the West Woods and came out to attack Hood's left flank. Both sides delivered devastating volleys into one another. The 1st Texas held their own against the entire brigade of Federals in the cornfield, taking a horrible amount of casualties. Law's men pushed back a couple of Union regiments. To the west, Hood's men were taking punishment from the Iron Brigade and finally broke ranks. With their left flank crumbling, the 1st Texas and Law's brigade were forced to retreat. The Confederate division had saved the rebel line, but they could not defend their position against the overwhelming numbers pushing against their battle lines. Major General Daniel Harvey Hill's division was just to the south, and getting word about the desperateness of the situation, he rushed 3 of his brigades north. The first to reach the field was Brigadier General Ripley's troops, who were able to push back the Union onslaught and take up a position on the southern fence row of the cornfield. Ripley himself was wounded in the throat in the advance, and he would hand over command to George Doles. The Confederate line was well anchored at the moment, but to the north, Major General Mansfield's 12th Corps began to arrive to aid the 1st Corps in destroying the Confederate flank. Mansfield's corps, which was made up of a combination of new recruits and veterans, had difficulty coming into battle lines under fire as the green troops moved from side to side to avoid the artillery shells being thrown their way. Mansfield himself helped form the battle lines to the east of the cornfield. While he was near the 10th Maine, a bullet struck him in the chest and he would die the next day. The 128th Pennsylvania, being one of the largest regiments on the field, advanced against Ripley's men, but their presence out in front of the Federal line drew heavy fire from the entire rebel brigade. The Pennsylvanians moved out of the firing range by moving east towards the woods and the 10th Maine. It was about 8 a.m. when the next brigade of D.H. Hill's division, under Colonel Alfred Colquitt, advanced through Ripley's line and pushed back more Federals from the cornfield. McRae's brigade from D.H. Hill's division was the last of the reinforcements that Hill could provide. Like many of the units at Antietam, McRae's men had fought hard engagements for around 3 weeks at this point. Most of their experienced officers were wounded or killed at Fox's Gap days earlier. Because of this, new officers confused the men with contradictory orders, and when they moved into the East Woods, one officer claimed to see blue troops on their flank, and panic spread throughout the ranks, sending McRae's 750 North Carolinians headed for the rear. Ripley's men and the conglomeration of troops on the Confederate right were running out of ammunition and exhausted. More of Mansfield's division arrived in the form of Tyndale and Steinrook's brigades. This buildup of Federal forces forced Hill's brigades to fall back. Tyndale and Steinrook's men pushed on towards the Dunker Church, threatening to capture the high ground around the building. Reinforcements soon hit the field for both sides. Major General John Sedgwick's division deployed into battle lines. Hood's disorganized division attempted to fight back, but could not stand against the approaching Federals. For the Confederates, Major General Lafayette McLaws' men emerged on the scene. Lee's men had fought all morning to keep the area around the cornfield. Some regiments had lost nearly 50% of their fighting force. Now the two sides became locked in a bitter struggle in the woods around the church. The Confederates were holding on for dear life to keep the entire army from being flanked. The sudden rush of troops in that sector were able to hold off the Union division. It was 10 a.m. and the fighting had come to a halt. The men in Hooker's 1st Corps, Mansfield's 12th Corps, and the rebels in Hood, Stark, Hill, and Lawton's divisions had fought for 5 exhausting hours. Lee had barely avoided disaster, but more Union divisions were pressing on the Confederate center around a sunken farm road that would take on immortal status as the Bloody Lane. Robert E. Lee had just been put in command of the Army of Northern Virginia in the summer of 1862, and after battering George McClellan's Army of the Potomac down the peninsula and away from the gates of Richmond, he turned his attention north. His offensive took him to the old Manassas battlefield, where he defeated a Union army in August, and with momentum on his side, he pushed on into Maryland and started his first invasion of the North. The two massive armies met along the Antietam Creek near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, and the result was the bloodiest single day in American history. The engagement began on the Confederate left around the Dunker Church, Miller's cornfield in the West Woods at about 5:15 a.m. As that fight began to phase out, the Union were concentrating their forces on the Confederate center, held by Division Commander Daniel Harvey Hill. However, Hill had sent 2 of his brigades to reinforce the Confederate left during the morning's fight, that under Alfred Colquitt and Duncan McRae. Both had been bloodied in the fight for the cornfield. For the moment, that left Hill with only the brigades of Robert Rhodes and George B. Anderson to guard the sunken road. The road itself was lower than the surrounding area because of the heavy use and erosion, which made it a great defensive location. Brigadier General Robert Rhodes rounded up the survivors of McRae and Colquitt's brigades and placed them on his left to extend his line. Lastly, he made contact with Brigadier General Hal Cobb of McLaws' division, who had strayed too far to the right during the morning assaults, and extended his line further to the left using Cobb. The quick-thinking Rhodes made the correct preparations because Hill's single division was going to encounter 2 divisions of the Union's 2nd Corps. The commander of that corps, Major General Edwin Sumner, brought his men forward to push back the Confederate left. He sent 2 divisions, one under General Sedgwick and one under General French, to attack. But Sedgwick did not wait for French and attacked with no support on his left. Once those attacks stalled out, it was French's division that would attack the sunken road held by Hill first. He arrayed his brigades with Max Weber in front, Dwight Morris's men behind him, and Nathan Kimball last. As Weber's men crested the ridge about 70 yards in front of the Confederates, Rhodes and Anderson's men stood in unison and fired a deadly volley into the 3 regiments. The Union troops fell back in a northerly direction, but made another attempt that ended the same way. It was repulsed. Morris's men were on their way to try their hand at dislodging the rebels. Morris's brigade moved up. The 14th Connecticut had never been under fire, and instead of moving past the 1st Delaware, shot from behind them, catching the 1st Delaware in a nasty crossfire, forcing them to move. Around this time, Weber would be wounded attempting to rally the 5th Maryland, ending his military career. As a lull began to emerge, Rhodes ordered his entire line to advance against the enemy. However, Colquitt barely moved, exposing the Alabamians to musketry on their left. Additionally, the 6th Alabama moved out late, which allowed the Union to pour lead into the 5th Alabama's right flank. The whole attack faltered, and Rhodes placed them back in the sunken road. Sumner ordered French to keep up the pressure, so French sent Kimball's brigade into the fray to attack the Confederates. As they made their way to the front, they noticed the other 2 brigades lying down just below the low-lying ridge. Kimball's men fixed bayonets, topped the ridge, and immediately came under heavy fire from the Alabamians and North Carolinians, forcing them behind the ridge. Now French's division deployed a different tactic. The Union troops were instructed to load, lying down, crawl to the crest of the ridge, fire, and then move back down to reload. The tactic had a horrible effect on Anderson and Rhodes's men. The rebels began piling more fence rails and even dead bodies of comrades to block the unceasing fire. Each side began to get reinforcements around this time. The final division of Sumner's corps under Israel Richardson made its way to the front to keep up the pressure. For the Confederates, Major General Richard H. Anderson's division arrived from a night march from Harper's Ferry and almost immediately got deployed to the center. Unfortunately for Anderson, he would be wounded upon taking the field, giving the command of his division to the little experienced Pryor. Instead of sending his men in all at one time, he sent them in piecemeal, with Wright being the first one deployed. His brigade of Georgians took up position on George Anderson's right, but Wright himself, as well as his second in command, would both fall wounded. The lack of officers made the battle more chaotic, as no one knew who was in charge. The Georgians were ordered to advance from their defensive positions, but only the 3rd Georgia moved, and they were repulsed by the 7th Virginia. Richardson ordered his Irish brigade under Thomas Meagher to attack with Caldwell on Meagher's left. Meagher's 4 regiments deployed, but when ordered to attack, only the regiments on the outside moved, dooming the attack. Caldwell got word that he needed to relieve Meagher, which prompted him to move his brigade in that direction. On the Confederate left, Rhodes saw the desperation of the situation and found Pryor and reported that the right needed reinforced immediately. The Confederate brigades that were held back now plunged into the sunken road. However, a combination of exhaustion and a lack of officers led to a chaotic situation in the road. At the same time, the Union were forming for another attack. Colonel Barlow of the combined 61st and 64th New York, in a stroke of initiative, moved around to the Confederate right, and when the attack launched, the pressure became too great for the rebels, who began to give way. Rhodes, seeing the Confederate line faltering, ordered the 6th Alabama to refuse the right flank to hopefully hold on as long as he could. However, the colonel of that regiment ordered his men to about face and forward march. When the 5th's commander asked him if that order was for the whole brigade, and it was confirmed yes, the Alabamians began to make for the rear, along with the rest of the Confederate center. In the disorganized rebel ranks, however, 4 regiments from 4 different brigades reformed to hold off a portion of the Union attack, but they quickly got pushed off the field. On Robert E. Lee's right, on the southern end of the battlefield, troops under Brigadier General Robert Toombs guarded the lower bridge across Antietam Creek. Toombs did not have his entire brigade, but only half. The 15th and 17th Georgia were defending the wagon train at Williamsport. Lee did supplement the force by placing the 50th Georgia from Thomas Drayton's division in that sector, which guarded the far right flank of Toombs' troops. The rebels fortified themselves behind rocks and makeshift breastworks against the approaching Federals. Opposing them across the creek were Union skirmishers from the 11th Ohio, part of the 9th Corps commanded by Major General Ambrose Burnside. The Federal Corps possessed 11,500 men, dwarfing the barely 500 Georgians defending the bridge. However, confusion in the command structure would play a huge role in the Federal attacks that cost so many Union troops their lives. On the campaign into Maryland, Burnside had been in charge of the Army of the Potomac's right wing, consisting of the 1st and 9th Corps. At Antietam, those 2 corps were on opposite sides of the battlefield. Union Army Commander George McClellan even ordered Burnside to take command of his 9th Corps, but Burnside seems to have ignored the order, acting as somewhat of a messenger between McClellan and the 9th Corps. Additionally, the officer in direct charge of the Corps, Major General Jesse Reno, had been killed at South Mountain, leaving Brigadier General Jacob Cox in command. Cox, unfamiliar with coordinating such a large force and unsure of his authority to command the Corps since Burnside was supposed to have taken over, remained in an almost limbo state, not wanting to overextend his authority, which led to a non-aggressive attack against the Confederates. At about 10 a.m. on the morning of September 17th, Burnside received the orders to take the bridge. The 11th Ohio pulled back after their prolonged skirmishing with the enemy, and the 11th Connecticut took their place against the rebels. The men from Connecticut approached the bridge and a small stone wall, but it did little to protect them from the lead thrown at them from the rifled muskets of the Georgians. Stuck in a severe firefight, Captain John Griswold jumped onto the stone wall, waving his sword, and ordered his men to cross the creek with him. However, only a handful of men made the attempt, which ended in the mortal wounding of Griswold as he crossed the creek, but he did make it to the other side. The colonel of the 11th Connecticut would be hit multiple times by rifle fire and be taken from the field, where he died the next day. The first attempt at taking the bridge had failed. Next, Colonel George Crook's brigade was ordered to advance on the bridge, but the orders were vague, and Crook did not understand that he was supposed to launch the main assault. He thought that job was for Sturgis's division, who was in that sector as well. But Sturgis was supposed to lay down a masking fire and divert the Confederate attention from Crook's men. Crook's first move was to send half of the 28th Ohio out as skirmishers, but the 20th Georgia's marksmanship threw them back. Crook then took the rest of the 28th and the 11th Ohio and ordered them against the bridge. The 5 companies of the 28th found good ground to engage in skirmishing with the Georgians, but the 11th Ohio fell back to safety. The second attempt to capture the bridge had failed, just like the first. To the south, Rodman's division was attempting to find a better way across the creek, but he was intimidated by the small 50th Georgia defending the shallow ford and decided to move his command further to the west to Snavely Ford. It was about 11:30 a.m. when the third assault began. Sturgis was ordered to send in Nagel's division at the double quick with bayonets fixed across the bridge. The Georgians had the movement well scouted, so when the 2nd Maryland and 6th New Hampshire came down the road to position themselves in front of the bridge, the withering fire from the Southerners wounded or killed 40% of the Marylanders, and about the same for the 6th New Hampshire. The 2 regiments huddled behind anything that would stop a bullet on the bank of Antietam Creek. Time was of the essence, and Cox knew he needed to move his men quickly across the bridge if they were going to get across it at all. So he ordered Sturgis to send in his other brigade under Ferrero, the twin 51st, the 51st Pennsylvania, and the 51st New York. They were tasked with taking the bridge. with support from 5 other regiments. As they advanced through the open fields toward the bridge, they were met with a destructive fire from the Georgians, but the rebels were running out of ammunition, and fast, but they had enough to pin down the 2 Union regiments. However, just to the north, the 28th Ohio had found a way across the creek, and they were crossing en masse with the rest of the brigade. Plus, Rodman's brigade under Colonel Harrison Fairchild had crossed the creek at Snavely Ford and were threatening the Southerners' flank. The commander of the 51st New York, Colonel Robert Potter, suggested to the 51st Pennsylvania's commander that they renew the attack. Colonel Hartranft declined, saying that he would have trouble getting his men to move. Potter, being the junior to Hartranft, asked if he could cross with his New Yorkers. Hartranft agreed, but when the New Yorkers rose to cross the bridge, the Pennsylvanians rose up too, and both regiments crossed the bridge together, each with their flags leading the way. Toombs' men had no choice but to retreat. Many of the Georgians got captured. Members of the 28th Ohio were furious at the loss of their comrades and were about to execute the prisoners until an officer intervened. The fighting for the bridge had been going on since about 9:30 that morning. It was now 2 o'clock, and the Union forces consisting of 3 divisions, those under Skaman, Sturgis, and Rodman, swarmed across the creek, assembling in battle lines to crush Robert E. Lee's right flank. What was left of the Georgians positioned themselves behind a stone wall about 900 yards to the west of the creek. On that flank, David R. Jones's division of fewer than 2,800 men were not capable of throwing back such a large force in front of them. However, as the rebels gazed across the battlefield at the enemy, the massive blue lines halted. General Cox asked Burnside if Sturgis's division could be replaced by Orlando Wilcox's division, since Sturgis's men had been horribly bloodied during the assault against the bridge. Burnside relented, but Sturgis's men would be kept on the west bank if needed. To add to further delay, the Union forces had to halt until the ammunition wagons could make it across the creek and resupply their cartridge boxes. This process would take roughly an hour and a half. All the while, Confederate forces began allocating troops to meet the Union assault. The rest of Robert Toombs' brigade did come up to relieve the battered 2nd and 20th Georgia, but it was a meager defense. Their only hope would be the division under A.P. Hill, who was marching as fast as his men could possibly go from Harper's Ferry. At 3:15 p.m., Burnside's men stepped off on their assault, with the right wing moving first, slamming into the Confederate forces positioned right outside of the town of Sharpsburg. Next, Rodman's division, on the left, moved out to attack the brigades of Kemper, Drayton, and Toombs. Harlan's brigade ran into a lot of problems. When the brigade moved out, the 8th Connecticut moved to the right, avoiding a cornfield, but the other 2 brigades entered the cornfield and remained there, not hearing the order to advance. Around this time, Major General A.P. Hill, wore out from his quick march from Harper's Ferry, was consulting with Major General D.R. Jones about the best course of action for engaging Burnside's corps. They agreed that Toombs' brigade would pull back and that Hill's lead brigade, the South Carolinians under Maxcy Gregg, would take their place and blunt the attack. On the Union right, Wilcox's division pushed back the rebel defenders, but a lack of ammunition forced them to hold back from pursuing the enemy. On the far right of the Confederate line, Gregg's brigade deployed, but the 14th went too far to the south and never engaged. Orr's rifles were held in reserve, leaving the 13th, 12th, and 1st South Carolina to enter the fray, but the 13th would misunderstand the orders and take up a position on the stone wall outside of the cornfield. The whole brigade of South Carolinians barely equaled the 750-man 16th Connecticut, the men from Connecticut only being in service for 3 weeks at this point. The Nutmeggers threw lead into the rebels and drove back the veteran brigade, and waited for more attacks with their bayonets fixed. Fairchild's brigade was ordered to fall back, being too far in advance of the Union line, which left the 8th Connecticut marching into certain death as it approached the mangled ranks of Confederates on the Harper's Ferry Road. On the men from Connecticut marched, engaging in a destructive firefight with Henry Benning's Georgians. The boys in blue did not want to give up their ground, but the infiltrating fire from the advancing North Carolinians from the south forced them to stubbornly fall back. During the fight, General Rodman rode to join the 8th, but never reached them. A Confederate bullet struck him in the chest, mortally wounding him. The 8th lost about 50% of the men they took into battle. Gregg's South Carolinians were about to pull back, unable to budge the 2 regiments from the cornfield, until Gregg was able to maneuver Orr's rifles to the flank the Rhode Islanders. The withering fire from their front and flank sent them to the rear, leaving the 16th alone, but they were also forced back. By this point, most of the Union assault had stalled out from exhaustion and lack of ammunition. The divisions of Wilcox and Rodman had pulled back to the safety of the bluffs overlooking the creek. Sturgis's division, who were taking a rest and filling their cartridge boxes while their brethren were making the assault, were now thrown out to hold off the approaching rebels. Toombs' Georgians had advanced to give chase to the 8th Connecticut, but had halted until Archer's brigade extended their right flank. Together, with help from Branch's and Gregg's brigades, the Confederates moved on Ewing's men, positioned behind a stone wall, and pushed them from their position, but not without taking heavy casualties. Archer's brigade lost about a third of its force within minutes of being engaged. Richard Garnett was able to muster a few dozen men from his broken brigade, and along with the parts of Kemper and Drayton's brigades, moved west across the rolling hills towards the enemy, and the Federals would break and head toward the creek. Although there would be light skirmishing along the line until dark, the Battle of Antietam had ended, the bloodiest single day in American history. By the end of the day on September 17th, both armies combined sustained 22,717 casualties, with the Union losing 2,108 killed, 9,540 wounded, and 753 missing or captured, for a total of 12,401. The Confederacy lost 1,546 killed, 7,752 wounded, and 1,018 missing or captured, for a total of 10,316. Thank you all so much for joining me as I detailed the fight for Burnside's Bridge. Please consider subscribing if you have not done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase a shirt from the Teespring store. Thank you all again, and have a great day.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.